Howdy, hello, and welcome to our third podcast episode, Invisible Monsters, A Desperate Escape from Hell. I'm Timothy, and I am here with my dear friend Thomas. Tonight, we're going to talk about a film called Pitch Black. As always, spoilers ahead, Pitch Black is a 2000 American science fiction horror film directed by David Tuohy about a dangerous criminal named Riddick who escapes from a spaceship crash, lands on an empty desert planet. When predatory creatures begin attacking the survivors, he joins forces with them to escape the planet. So, Tom, did you like Pitch Black?
Well, Timothy, I wouldn't say that I particularly enjoyed Pitch Black, but I did find it an interesting premise. The idea of a group of strangers trying to survive on an alien planet with these deadly creatures is intriguing, and the fact that they have to rely on each other for help makes for some tense moments.
I can see what you mean, Tom. But personally, I found it a bit too predictable and slow-paced for my taste. The characters were quite stereotypical as well, and the whole plot seemed rather cliché to me. However, I must admit that there were some nice visual effects in the film which made up for its flaws in other departments.
Well, Tim, I don't know if I'd go so far as to call them nice per se, but they did serve their purpose in creating an atmosphere of terror and suspense on screen. However, I do agree with you about the characters being rather two-dimensional. There wasn't much depth or development there.
Maybe not nice, but at least effective enough to keep me interested in what was happening on screen. And while we're talking about characters, I have to say that I found the character of Riddick to be quite intriguing. The whole idea of someone with enhanced senses being vulnerable under certain circumstances was fascinating.
Well, Tim, I think you might be overlooking some of the other issues with the characters in Pitch Black. For example, why did they all seem to make such ridiculous decisions throughout the film? The whole situation could have been avoided if they had just listened to Riddick's advice or been more cautious from the start. It felt like the writers were trying too hard to create drama and tension instead of focusing on character development.
Maybe so, Tom. But you have to admit that there was a certain level of suspense maintained throughout the film. You never quite knew when or where one of these creatures would appear next, which kept me engaged in the story. And speaking of the story itself, I thought it was interesting how they managed to tie everything together with this whole backstory about the planet's history and the geologists who were studying it before them.
Well, Tim, while I can appreciate your point about suspense and the world-building aspects of the story, I still think that there was room for improvement in terms of character development and overall plot structure. The film relied too much on action sequences and jump scares to keep audiences interested, rather than focusing on creating well-rounded characters or developing a more cohesive narrative arc.
I see what you mean, Tom, but at least they managed to create some interesting dynamics between the characters, like this tension between Riddick and Johns over their past history and their differing opinions on how to handle situations. It was quite entertaining to watch them butt heads throughout the film.
Well, I guess you could say that there were some moments of intrigue between these characters, but overall, it didn't make up for what I saw as a lackluster storyline. The film tried too hard to be dark and gritty without actually giving us any depth or complexity in terms of character development or plot progression. And don't even get me started on how predictable some aspects were. You could see certain twists coming from a mile away.
Maybe you're right, Tom. But I still think that Pitch Black had its moments where it managed to capture the essence of what makes science fiction horror films enjoyable. The idea behind these creatures was quite fascinating. These blind predators who could sense their prey through other means was quite original, and it made for some suspenseful scenes throughout the film.
Well, while I can appreciate your perspective on the creatures in Pitch Black, I still believe that they were used as a crutch by the writers to carry an otherwise weak storyline. Instead of focusing on developing interesting characters or crafting a compelling narrative arc, they relied too heavily on these monsters to create tension and drama. It felt like they were more concerned with shock value than building an engaging world for their audience to explore.
I see your point there, Tom, but at least Vin Diesel's performance as Riddick was quite good. He managed to bring some depth and nuance to what could have been a one-dimensional character. And I thought the way he interacted with the other survivors was quite interesting, too, especially his relationship with Fry.
Well, while Vin Diesel did indeed deliver a solid performance as Riddick, it wasn't enough to save Pitch Black from its myriad of other issues. The film tried too hard to be dark and edgy without providing any real substance or depth for its characters or storyline. It felt more like an exercise in style over substance than a genuinely engaging cinematic experience.
Maybe you're right, Tom, but at least it had some redeeming qualities. It was visually stunning in parts, and the action sequences were quite well executed. I think if they had focused more on those aspects and less on trying to be overly dark or gritty, it could have been a much better film overall.
Well, while I can appreciate your point about the visuals and action sequences in Pitch Black, I still believe that those elements were not enough to save what was ultimately a flawed and underdeveloped storyline. The film had so much potential with its intriguing premise and interesting cast of characters, but unfortunately, it failed to deliver on that promise due to poor writing and questionable decision-making behind the scenes.
Maybe so, Tom. But at least it had some redeeming qualities. It was visually stunning in parts, and the action sequences were quite well executed. I think if they had focused more on those aspects and less on trying to be overly dark or gritty, it could have been a much better film overall.
Well, while I can appreciate your point about the visuals and action sequences in Pitch Black, I still believe that those elements were not enough to save what was ultimately a flawed and underdeveloped storyline. The film had so much potential with its intriguing premise and interesting cast of characters, but unfortunately, it failed to deliver on that promise due to poor writing and questionable decision-making behind the scenes. I guess we'll have to agree to disagree about Pitch Black. But speaking of things we can all appreciate, let's talk about the soundtrack for a moment. The score for this film was absolutely incredible. It perfectly captured the eerie atmosphere and tense moments throughout the movie. The use of percussion instruments like drums and gongs added an extra layer of suspense, while haunting melodies played during quieter scenes kept me on edge at all times.
I see your point about the soundtrack being well done, Tom, but personally, I found it a bit too overbearing and intrusive at times. It felt like the music was trying to tell us how we should feel during certain scenes rather than letting the visuals and acting speak for themselves, but nonetheless, it did contribute to creating an overall sense of dread and unease throughout the film, which I think is commendable.
Well, while I can understand your perspective on the music being intrusive at times, I still believe that it played a vital role in enhancing the viewing experience for me. The composer did an excellent job of blending various elements together, such as electronic sounds and traditional orchestral instruments, to create this unique sonic landscape that perfectly complemented the film's dark and gritty tone.
I see your point there, Tom, but at least we can agree on one thing. Pitch Black had its flaws, but was still an interesting experiment in science fiction horror films. Maybe if they had focused more on character development and less on shock value, it could have been a much better film overall.
Well, I guess you're right about that, Tim. It's always disappointing when a movie with such promise falls flat due to poor storytelling or execution. But at least we can appreciate some of the elements they got right, like the soundtrack and visual effects. And who knows, maybe if there's enough demand for it, they'll make a sequel that addresses some of these issues and delivers an even more compelling cinematic experience than before.
Maybe so, Tom. But at least we can agree on one thing. Pitch Black had its flaws, but was still an interesting experiment in science fiction horror films. Maybe if they had focused more on character development and less on shock value, it could have been a much better film overall.
Well, I guess you're right about that, Tim. It's always disappointing when a movie with such promise falls flat due to poor storytelling or execution. But at least we can appreciate some of the elements they got right, like the soundtrack and visual effects. And who knows, maybe if there's enough demand for it, they'll make a sequel that addresses some of these issues and delivers an even more compelling cinematic experience than before.
I see your point about hoping for a better sequel, Tom, but let's not get ahead of ourselves just yet. How about we take a moment to discuss the actors and their characters in Pitch Black? I thought Vin Diesel did an excellent job as Riddick. He brought depth and nuance to what could have been a one-dimensional character. His interactions with other survivors, especially Fry, were quite interesting, too. What did you think about his portrayal of the character, Tom?
Well, I agree that Vin Diesel's performance was indeed one of the strongest aspects of Pitch Black. He managed to bring a sense of vulnerability and resourcefulness to the character of Riddick, which made him quite compelling to watch. However, I also think that he was let down by some of the writing choices for his character. There were times when it felt like they were relying too heavily on cliched tough guy tropes rather than developing a more complex backstory or motivation for Riddick's actions throughout the film.
That's an interesting point you bring up there, Tom. I can see where you're coming from about the writing choices for Riddick's character. But what about some of the other actors and their performances in Pitch Black? Did anyone else stand out to you as being particularly good or bad in their roles?
Well, while none of the other performances quite matched Vin Diesel's portrayal of Riddick, I thought that Cole Hauser did an admirable job playing William J. Johns. He brought a sense of authority and determination to his role, which helped ground some of the more outlandish plot points in the film. On the flip side, I thought Radha Mitchell's performance as Carolyn Fry was a bit underwhelming. At times, there were moments where she seemed wooden or unconvincing in her actions and reactions to certain situations throughout the movie.
That's an interesting perspective on those two characters. I can see how their performances could have been seen as either good or bad, depending on someone's personal taste. But overall, do you think that Pitch Black was a success in terms of its casting choices and character development? Or were there too many flaws for it to be considered effective in those areas?
Well, while I don't think that Pitch Black is a shining example of excellent character development or casting choices, I do believe that it had its moments. The film tried to create an ensemble cast with diverse personalities and backgrounds. But unfortunately, they weren't able to fully realize those characters due to the limited screen time and poor writing choices. If anything, this just goes to show how important it is for a movie like Pitch Black, or any science fiction horror film for that matter, to focus on developing strong characters and plot lines in order to truly engage its audience and create a memorable viewing experience.
I see your point there, Tom. It's clear that Pitch Black had some interesting ideas, but fell short when it came to execution. Maybe if they had focused more on character development and less on shock value, it could have been a much better film overall. But what about the direction of the film? Do you think David Twohy did an adequate job bringing this story to life?
Well, while I can appreciate that David Twohy tried to create a tense and atmospheric environment in Pitch Black, I think he could have done better. There were some moments where the pacing felt off or certain scenes dragged on longer than they needed to, which took away from the overall suspense of the film. Additionally, there were times when it seemed like he was more focused on creating visually striking images rather than allowing the story and characters to drive the narrative forward. However, I will say that some of his choices in terms of cinematography and lighting were quite effective in establishing the bleak and desolate world these characters inhabit.
That's an interesting perspective on David Tui's direction for Pitch Black, Tom. It seems like he had some strengths, but also struggled in other areas. I think it just goes to show how important it is for a director to find the right balance between creating visually striking images and telling a compelling story. But overall, what would you say were the biggest successes and failures of Pitch Black?
Well, while there's certainly no shortage of flaws in Pitch Black, I do think it had its moments. The visual effects were quite impressive for their time and helped to create a unique and eerie atmosphere throughout the film. Additionally, Vin Diesel's performance as Riddick was truly outstanding and managed to elevate what could have been a one-dimensional character into someone who was both vulnerable and resourceful. However, I think the biggest failure of Pitch Black was its inability to balance these strengths with effective storytelling and character development. The script relied too heavily on cliches and predictable plot points which detracted from what could have been a much more engaging cinematic experience.
That's an excellent point, Tom. It seems like Pitch Black struggled with balancing its various elements. But do you think there is any potential for a sequel or reboot to address these issues and deliver an even better film? Or should they just leave well enough alone?
Well, while I wouldn't say that Pitch Black necessarily needs a sequel or reboot, I don't think it hurts to explore the possibility of improving upon its flaws. There is definitely potential in expanding upon the world and characters introduced in the first film, especially given how popular Vin Diesel has become over the years. However, any such endeavors would need to be approached with caution. They must find a way to balance the elements that made Pitch Black successful while also addressing its shortcomings. Only then can we hope for an even more compelling cinematic experience than before.
I can see where you're coming from there, Tom. But what about the cultural impact of Pitch Black? I mean, it was released in 2000 and had quite a big following at the time. Do you think it has had any lasting influence on the sci-fi horror genre or cinema as a whole?
Well, while Pitch Black may not be remembered as one of the all-time great science fiction horror films, it did have some impact on popular culture and the film industry. Its visual effects and dark atmosphere influenced many subsequent movies in the genre, such as Underworld and Chronicle. Additionally, the film's success helped launch Vin Diesel's career into the stratosphere, leading to his starring roles in blockbuster franchises like The Fast and the Furious and Guardians of the Galaxy. Moreover, Pitch Black also spawned a prequel TV series titled Riddick: Merc City, which explored the character's origins further. While the show only lasted one season, it demonstrated that there was still an audience interested in the world and characters created by David Tui. In conclusion, while Pitch Black may not be perfect, it did leave its mark on the science fiction horror genre and popular culture as a whole. Its success helped launch careers and spawn sequels and spin-offs. It's clear that there is potential for a reboot or sequel to address some of the flaws from the original film while building upon its strengths.
I guess we can both agree on one thing, Tom. Pitch Black had its flaws, but it's not necessarily a complete failure either. There were some interesting ideas and elements throughout the film that could potentially be built upon in a sequel or reboot. Only time will tell if they decide to explore that possibility further.
Absolutely, Tim. I couldn't agree more. While Pitch Black might not have been perfect, it did offer an intriguing premise and some standout performances from Vin Diesel and Cole Hauser. It would be interesting to see how a reboot or sequel could address the shortcomings of the original while also capitalizing on its strengths.
Speaking of which, before we wrap up this discussion, let's take a moment to remind our viewers about our social media links and email addresses. Remember, guys, if you liked what you heard in today's video or have any thoughts or suggestions for future episodes, feel free to reach out and say hello.
Yes, indeed, Tim. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and share this video with your friends and family. We love hearing from our viewers and appreciate all the support we've received so far. Until next time, everyone, take care and enjoy the rest of your evening.